My hands kept moving while the message traffic tightened, and the room stayed dim and airless. I copied bearings and damage words exactly as the system demanded, even when the margins felt too thin. I could feel how a single mistake would cost time no one had left to spend. When the confirmations finally came through, I logged them without a sound. June 1942 placed the United States Navy in a strained operational position in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had been attacked 6 months earlier. American forces had begun to recover, but the balance of initiative still mattered day by day. Japan had expanded rapidly across the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia. American commanders faced the task of defending remaining positions while rebuilding striking power. Carrier aviation, intelligence, and long-distance logistics were central concerns. As the Midway Atoll, northwest of Hawaii, had become a forward outpost whose loss would tighten the pressure on Oahu. In that setting, the Pacific Fleet prepared to meet a Japanese operation aimed at Midway. The American decision to contest the move relied on incomplete information, difficult timing, and a narrow margin for error. Naval actions in the Central Pacific depended on flight operations, fuel endurance, and the ability to locate the enemy first. Carriers could not afford to be careless. They also could not afford to remain passive. The work that supported this contest was not limited to admirals and pilots. It also depended on specialists whose tasks were technical and unglamorous. One of those specialists was a Navy radioman assigned to a code and communications watch in Hawaii. His job was to handle message traffic and maintain disciplined procedure under heavy load. He was not a decision maker. He was part of the system that moved information from collection to distribution. In the months before Midway, that system was under constant strain, and the strain was not evenly visible across the fleet. In late May 1942, he worked in a secure communications environment where routine never meant calm. A watch might begin with predictable administrative signals, then shift quickly to higher priority traffic. Equipment required careful handling. Signals had to be logged. Headers and call signs had to be copied accurately. Errors could waste time or misdirect a warning. There was no room for theatrical urgency, only the steady pressure of getting it right. And the radioman's work connected to a broader effort in Hawaii to understand Japanese intentions. American cryptologic work, including Navy code-breaking efforts, had been producing insights into Japanese operations. These insights were rarely complete. They did not arrive as a clear map with date and hour marked. They arrived as partial reconstructions, educated guesses, and assessments that had to be weighed against what was unknown. Even when analysts felt confident, commanders still had to decide how much risk to accept. By the end of May, American planners assessed that Japan was preparing a major move, and that AF in Japanese traffic likely referred to Midway. The radioman did not see the full analytic process. He saw the downstream effect. Message precedence increased. Routing became more sensitive. The flow of instructions, acknowledgments, and clarifications thickened. The volume itself signaled that something was being set in motion. At the same time, operational security remained tight. Information had to be shared, but not broadcast. Messages were distributed through formal channels. Some went to commanders afloat. Some went to shore installations. Some were restricted to small groups. The radioman learned to treat every paper copy, every typed strip, and every repeated transmission as something that carried weight beyond his room. On Midway itself, service members worked under the constraints of an isolated atoll. Aviation fuel, spare parts, and repair facilities were limited. Aircraft included marine fighters and bombers, along with Navy patrol planes. Runways were exposed. Defenses included anti-aircraft guns and coastal batteries, but the atoll could not absorb sustained attack indefinitely. Its value was in its position and its ability to extend American reconnaissance. The Radioman's routine continued as the fleet moved. American carriers sortied to intercept the Japanese approach. The movement of ships required radio discipline and careful coordination. There were times when radio silence mattered and times when contact reports were essential. Every transmission carried risk of being detected. Every delay carried risk of being too late. As the Japanese force advanced, the problem became locating it in time. A carrier battle depended on search aircraft finding the enemy first, then reporting accurately, then guiding strike groups to a moving target. Weather could complicate searches. Mechanical problems could cancel sorties. And navigation errors could scatter search patterns. Misidentification could send planes toward the wrong bearing. The system could fail in small ways that produced large consequences. In early June, the Radioman station handled traffic that reflected a tightening contest. Search plans, readiness conditions, and coordination signals passed through established circuits. There was no single moment when the entire picture became clear to everyone. Instead, pieces aligned across different compartments of the war. Analysts in Hawaii had a view of Japanese plans. Commanders at sea had a view of their fuel state and flight decks. Pilots had a view of fuel clouds, engine temperatures, and the empty horizon. On June 4, 1942, the engagement began in earnest. Japanese aircraft struck Midway in the morning, but the atoll's defenders responded with anti-aircraft fire and fighter interceptions. Damage occurred, but the airfield remained usable. The Japanese planned a second strike to finish the job. Their carriers began cycling aircraft, refueling, and rearming in preparation. This process required time and space on crowded hangar decks. It also created vulnerability if the enemy struck while ordnance and fuel lines were exposed. American aircraft from Midway launched to attack the Japanese carriers. These attacks were costly and largely ineffective in immediate results, but they forced the enemy to maneuver and contributed to confusion. The essential task remained finding the carriers and delivering a coordinated blow. American carrier air groups were preparing to launch, but timing depended on sighting reports and estimates of the enemy's location. The Radioman in Hawaii was not present on the flight decks. His role was distant, but not detached. He followed the flow of reports that came back. He learned which messages arrived with urgency and which arrived with corrections. He saw the signs of friction. A report might be relayed with uncertain wording. A contact might be described by ship count without clear identification. A follow-up might revise a bearing. In a carrier battle, these small differences could determine whether strike aircraft arrived with fuel to spare or returned to a dark ocean. As the morning developed, American carrier aircraft launched to strike. The strike groups included dive bombers and torpedo planes supported by fighters. Coordination among these groups was difficult. Different aircraft types had different speeds and operational altitudes. Communications in the air were limited. Navigation depended on compasses, dead reckoning, and visual cues. Cloud layers could hide fleets and break formations. American torpedo squadrons attacked at low altitude and suffered severe losses. They drew defensive fire and fighter attention. They pressed attacks under conditions that offered little protection. Their sacrifice did not immediately disable Japanese carriers, but it shaped the battle space by pulling enemy fighters down and consuming defensive focus. Later that morning, American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers at a decisive moment. The Japanese decks were crowded with aircraft being serviced and armed. Bomb hits sparked fires and secondary explosions. Multiple carriers were set ablaze and became combat ineffective. The effect was not instant victory, but it shifted the balance of carrier strength in the engagement. The radioman received the reports as they filtered back through command channels. He did not cheer in the room. He logged, transmitted, and confirmed. He saw the language of damage assessments and contact updates. He noted the change in tone when confirmations replaced guesses. He also saw the continued uncertainty about the surviving enemy carrier and the need to locate it before it could strike back. The battle did not end with the first wave of American success. Japan still had capacity to hit back, and one Japanese carrier remained operational for a time. American forces had to manage damaged aircraft, fuel shortages, and the risk of counterattack. Said recovery of planes was a complex evolution. Pilots returned low on fuel. Landing signals had to be clear. Deck crews had to move rapidly while maintaining safety. A single mishap could block the deck and prevent further recoveries. That afternoon, and into the following day, American forces continued searching and striking. The remaining Japanese carrier was eventually hit and put out of action. The Japanese surface elements began withdrawing. The engagement concluded with heavy Japanese carrier losses and significant American losses, including a fleet carrier. The tactical outcome was clear enough, but the operational meaning would be judged over time through subsequent campaigns and resource commitments. For the radioman, the immediate aftermath was not a clean return to routine. The communications load remained high. Reports had to be compiled. Damage and casualty information moved through the system. Requests for replacements and supplies followed. Operational security remained important because the wider war did not pause to absorb one battle's outcome. In the days after Midway, the Navy examined what had gone right and what had nearly gone wrong. The reliance on intelligence assessments was studied. The timing of launches and the coordination of attacks were analyzed. The performance of search efforts and scouting reports received close attention. So did the vulnerabilities created by limited communications and imperfect situational awareness. From a distance, Midway could be described as a battle of carriers and pilots. Within the system, it was also a battle of processes. The ability to convert fragmented information into timely action mattered at every stage. Cryptologic analysis in Hawaii provided a strategic edge, but it still required commanders to commit forces at risk. Search reports provided the tactical link, but they depended on individual aircrews' accuracy and judgment. Strike execution depended on pilots' skill and endurance, and on deck crews' discipline under threat. The radioman remained a small but essential part of that chain. He had worked through the buildup, the day of battle, and the immediate aftermath without a public role. His training emphasized procedure, clarity, and speed. The work demanded emotional control. A message had to be sent the same way, whether it carried routine routing information or the first confirmation that enemy carriers were burning. And his experience also reflected the institutional changes underway in 1942. The Navy was adapting rapidly after Pearl Harbor. Communications security, intelligence integration, and carrier task force doctrine were evolving under pressure. The radioman saw new instructions, revised call signs, changing routing rules, and tighter restrictions on what could be said over the air. The service was learning to operate in a Pacific environment where distances were vast and information could be incomplete until the moment it was needed. Midway did not remove the need for hard choices. The United States still had to fight across an ocean. It still had to build ships, train air crews, and maintain supply lines. It still had to contest island chains where airfields and anchorages mattered. The battle's outcome did, however, influence how American leaders judged risk in the Central Pacific in the months that followed. It also affected Japanese capability to conduct large carrier operations at the scale seen earlier in 1942. In the quieter corners of the war effort, the Radioman returned to his watch schedule. He handled traffic that shifted toward follow-on operations and the steady grind of logistics. The tempo rose and fell with fleet movements and reconnaissance cycles. The room where he worked remained a place of controlled focus. There were no medals pinned there, no photographers documenting the hours, and no speeches. The record was in logs and message copies, in procedures followed under pressure, and in the absence of errors that might have cost time. When the Navy later documented lessons learned, it emphasized systems that were often invisible to the public. It noted the need to protect intelligence sources while still warning commanders in useful terms. It stressed the importance of reliable circuits for contact reports. It refined protocols for message precedence and routing. It improved training for personnel whose jobs were to pass information accurately, not interpret it. The Radioman's contribution fit within that emphasis. He was one of many who did not fly into flak or stand behind gun shields, but whose work helped the fleet function. He represented the broader class of wartime specialists who made modern naval warfare possible. Their tasks were repetitive, technical, and easily overlooked. They were also points of failure if neglected, and because a fleet without accurate communications and disciplined information handling could not coordinate dispersed forces across thousands of miles. As 1942 continued, the United States moved into further operations in the Pacific. The burden of war expanded. Shipyards worked continuously. Training pipelines grew. The Navy's communications and intelligence organizations became larger and more formal. New personnel arrived and had to be integrated into existing routines. The Radioman trained newcomers in procedure, emphasizing accuracy over speed when the two conflicted, and speed once accuracy was assured. The legacy of Midway within the communications environment was a greater respect for how quickly circumstances could shift. A calm watch could become a crisis in minutes. A single contact report could redirect ships and aircraft. A delayed transmission could narrow options. This did not create constant panic. It created a steady seriousness that shaped routine. Years later, many wartime accounts focused on the visible elements of Midway. They described dive bombers falling out of the sun and carriers burning. They described torpedo squadrons that suffered devastating losses. They described commanders making decisions with limited information. Far less attention went to those in rooms far from the sea who kept the flow of information intact. The Radioman story was not unique, but it was representative. He served in a role where competence meant being unnoticed. When the system worked, it was assumed. When the system failed, it was scrutinized. His success was measured in clean logs, correct headers, and messages delivered to the right stations without compromise. In the historical record, such work rarely receives detailed treatment because it produces few dramatic images. It produced instead the administrative skeleton of operations. That skeleton supported the muscle and movement of fleets. In 1942, when America's carrier forces were limited and every operational decision carried heavy consequences, the reliability of communications and intelligence handling mattered. Midway became associated with a shift in momentum, but within the daily life of the war effort, momentum was experienced as workload. More sorties meant more traffic. More task forces meant more routing complexity. More security meant more rules. The Radioman adapted to each change as it arrived. He did so without expecting recognition, but because the culture of his work valued quiet competence. The Pacific War continued for years after Midway, shaped by battles, shipbuilding, and industrial capacity. The Radioman's service continued as part of that larger machine. When historians later traced why American forces were able to contest Japanese operations in 1942, they returned repeatedly to the interplay of intelligence, scouting, and carrier aviation. All three required disciplined communications. In Hawaii, the rooms where messages were copied and relayed did not become monuments. They were repurposed, remodeled, or replaced as technology changed. The men who worked there returned to civilian life after the war, or continued in service. Some spoke little about their role, either from habit or from lingering security restrictions. But their memories were often procedural rather than dramatic. They remembered shifts, equipment, and the sound of printers and headsets. They remembered the weight of handling information that mattered, even when they could not discuss its content openly. The unsung individual in this account was not a lone hero making a decisive choice. He was part of the connective tissue of a fleet under strain. He represented the reality that large operations depend on thousands of small acts performed correctly. In June 1942, as American forces contested Japan's move toward Midway, those small acts contributed to a system that functioned under stress. The record of his work remained in routine documents rather than public memory. It remained in the accuracy of communications that allowed commanders to act. But it remained in the steady professionalism that helped keep information moving when the stakes were high and the margin for error was